Today is a bit of a deep dive on the Goggles X from CaddX with regards to their thermal behaviour. There are a number of people reporting when they're getting their new goggles that they're finding that they're having a problem with the right hand display. That is either turning off completely or that it is changing colour or going a tinge yellow or green. Now, the consensus on this from CaddX has been that this is an overheating issue, and they've been providing users with tips and hints on how to resolve this. First of all, making sure that none of the vents are blocked, offering new firmware. The last firmware update improved the fan behaviour, and there's another firmware update around the corner as well. But more bizarrely, they have even offered one user a replacement heatsink for the top of his goggles as well to try and alleviate the issue. We've also seen a whole host of mods being posted online from people showing them installing fans on the top to try and stop this behaviour, but there are a number of people out there, including people like me with the pre-release goggles, who have not suffered from this problem at all and are having no issues with their goggles whatsoever. What I'm going to do today is a complete thermal breakdown on these goggles. We're going to tear them apart, we're going to get them under the thermal camera, and I'm even going to bake them in my 3D printer to try and cause this issue. And then at the very end, I'm going to share with you my opinion on what is going on here and try and answer the question of if there is a fundamental design issue with these goggles. Now, I really do hope you found this video interesting. If you do, please don't forget to give it a like. If you'd like to support the channel, there are also links to my Patreon as well as buy me a coffee in the description as well. Anyway, let's get on with it and let's just talk a little bit more about the issue first of all, and then we'll tear these goggles down. Now, just to explain exactly what the reported issue is, people are saying that they're finding that their right-hand display on their goggles, looking at them from the back, is either turning off or going a tinge of green. Now, CaddX have told users they believe this is due to the goggles overheating. There are people reporting this happening within sort of 15 minutes of use, and there are people reporting it happening after an hour or more of use. It seems to be more common in the HDMI input mode, but there are reports of it happening in all of the mode, and what isn't clear is what the specifics are on this issue and what is the trigger points and what is not. In the most recent firmware update for these goggles, CaddX did make a slight change in the firmware for the fan behaviour, but they also added the ability for us to see the temperature of the OLED displays as well, and we're going to be looking at that in this video as we move through. If you don't know how to access this yourself, if you go into the display settings on the goggles and set the display zoom to 10%, the debug menu will appear on the screen, and as part of the debug menu, it will show you the LED 1 temp and the LED 2 temp. LED 1 is the right hand display from the back, and LED 2 is the left hand display, and this will allow you to be able to see what the temperatures are of your OLEDs. So let's take a look around the goggles first of all and tear them down, and then we'll do some thermal testing. Okay, now looking around the goggles externally first of all, and just looking at the obvious signs of cooling and vents and things like that. So the first things you'll see on the top are these two vents up here. We then have a vent on the side here. There's clearly a fan behind that one, you can hear it. And then if we look around the rest of the goggles, the only other place you'll find a vent is down here under the nose piece. Now this one is quite a large area, it's quite a decent sized grid, so I don't think there's going to be too many issues with airflow making its way through that one. However, I do have to say I don't think this is going to be the greatest. This is an exhaust vent. That I can tell just from feeling around the goggle, and this is an input vent. That one though, I do think is quite restrictive. Whilst you can feel just that sort of pattern of holes, there does seem to be a fan behind it, but we'll have a look at that when we tear them down. But it's not going to be a great way of getting air out of the goggles, that's for sure. If we then just look in the display area, you then have some vents in the corners, so there's some there and there. And whilst I initially in my review thought there was air coming out of these, it actually seems to be that they are draw vents. Air is being sucked in through these as part of the cooling. But again, we need to tear these goggles down to have a look at what's actually going on to understand it more. So what I'm going to do next is get the shells apart, and then we'll take a look at what we find inside. Okay, now I've got the top cover off, and this is where you will find that replaceable module. Now this is the Avatar HD module part of the goggles. It has the main system chipset as well as the RF side for the Avatar HD, and it also has the Wi-Fi board on as well. However, there isn't anything on this with regards to the display drivers and with regards to the HDMI in and analog. All of that appears to be on more boards inside the goggles. Now, as I have shown already, we do have those vents on the top, and we'll look at this a bit more closely in a minute. We do have a vent down there where the air comes in, and there's various holes around here that do go in to the chassis. But what I think we'll do is keep digging, get the top shell off, and then have a proper look at what's going on. Now, just to show you the teardown at this level, we've now got the top cover off. You can see our fan here. We've got our other boards over here, as well as a board on the front, which is the main I/O board. And then we've got our displays here in the middle. Now, just walking you through the location of components elsewhere, we have our two boards over here. These are what take our power input and our I/O. And then on the front of the goggles, if I tip it up, you then have the main I/O board. This board is the one that has our analog converter as well as our HDMI switch. We've got our fan connector, our ribbon cables that go to our displays, and the large chip you can see in the middle there is our HDMI switcher, which we'll take a look at more closely when we look at the board in a bit more detail. And then directly behind that board, in these two little circular pieces here, you have the optics. Now you can see in there that the cable actually comes from this board at the back here. It flips around and it's folded actually behind this PCB up against the back of the displays. Now, just getting in closer to show you the displays, you can see the cable there going in, and then if I tilt it back, you can see that PCB there. There really is not a lot of gap between the back of the display and that PCB board. It is the same on both sides. What you've got is the PCB there with the display cable going there. And what I'm going to say is there isn't a lot of airflow going to be making it through this area, but that isn't to say that those displays are going to be producing a huge amount of heat, and we'll take a look at that a bit more under the thermal camera in a minute. Now, I've put the main RF PCB back on the top simply because that gives us a better indication of what is going on. So in these goggles, we have two fans. There is a fan here on the side, and there is another fan down here you can see just there, which we'll take a closer look at in a minute. This fan on the side drags in air from here, and that is then pushed out of the top into this area here in the top of the goggles. Now, this is that separate compartment that I've removed. That is this part here. And what you can see, if I lay this up here and tip it back, is that there's a channel down there. You can just see my thumb sticking through, and that is where the airflow is being directed into, and that is then being blown into this duct area here over the top of this PCB. Now, on the top cover, we then have some vents where the air is expelled out of here as well as here. We then, inside the goggles, have another fan located down here in the bottom of the goggles that expel air from inside the cavity out of this nose area. Now, this is dragging air from inside the whole cavity area. As I mentioned just now, this fan doesn't actually blow air directly into this cavity. It blows it over the top module, with the majority of it coming out the top, but you will then get some air being expelled by this little fan down there in the bottom that is blowing it out. Now, just to show you this with the board back in, we still have everything that I've said. So the fan coming over and blowing the air in, that is coming over the top of this heatsink, but it's what's happening from here is what's quite interesting, because you can see there is this little foam pad that goes around there. And if you look at the bottom of the top cover, there's actually an airflow channel integrated already. This airflow channel, though, has different paths. So this path that comes in from here goes over the top of this IC chip here, which is the memory chips, goes all the way across, and it vents out of there, which is the bottom half of this top cover. That means that airflow is going to come over the top here, pick up the heat from the transceivers, and then from the memory, and then push it out of that part there. What is interesting, though, is that that air isn't going anywhere else in the goggles. They've actually masked it off to prevent it. And then what you have for this bit of vent here and this bit of vent here is this front area, which is this area in here, which is separate. Now, on these goggles, some of the channels have actually been blocked by the PCB and this metal cover. So whereas I showed you earlier you had this channel that goes down here, that is now blocked. What you still have though is channels here, here, here and here. And these actually could be areas where the goggles suck in air for that fan located at the bottom. And what you almost have is this back area here blowing out the hot air off this module, and this front area here helping drag air into the goggles alongside the vents that are located either side of the displays. Now, with regards to the optics, I haven't actually torn these ones down myself. However, one of the fantastic supporters of this channel, M. Bundy, has, and he has shared with me some images of the optics setup, and specifically the heat sinks on the back of the optics as well as what is underneath. What's quite interesting when we look at this torn down is that the displays themselves are obviously mounted on these metal plates that go into the optics module. You then have the connector that comes over the back, and then there's a heat sink that mounts on top of that. The interesting part, though, is the fact that there's not any thermal pads here. There's nothing to really help move the heat away from the back of the display. What they're doing is mounting the heatsink to the back of the connector. The connector then goes up against the back of the OLED display. Whilst the sides of the heatsink do actually meet the back of the OLED display, there is no thermal pads, no thermal paste, and the thermal conductivity is absolutely minimal. Also, when you look at this optical module, you'll notice that these heat sinks are actually countersunk into the module itself as well. So whilst they are going to radiate heat, they're going to struggle to get any passing airflow that may be moving inside the goggles. Looking internally as well, you'll see that the cable comes over the top of the heatsink, again covering it, restricting the amount of airflow. And whilst you are going to get some natural convection, it is going to be fairly minimal. And add on top of that, the pretty poor thermal conductivity that you're going to have with that heatsink being mounted to the connector to the display with no thermal compound or pads between. Now, thanks to the amazing work Mike has done, we have also been able to now identify what displays are used in these goggles. They are the Sia SY049s WDM01s. Now, Sia is one of the bigger brands that make small OLED displays. They're actually not cheap. They are very good displays as we understand it, and they are pretty much what we would expect to find in a goggle of this class. They're rated at 90 Hz, 1920 by 1080p resolution, 3692 ppi, and they have an operating temperature range of -20 to +70 degrees. It's exactly the display we would expect to find in a high-end set of goggles like this, and actually it's very likely the same or similar display used by the likes of DJI. I want to say a big thank you to the Big M for sending these over. It has also allowed me to compare my goggles to images of his and others online, and I haven't been able to see any difference between my pre-release goggles and the publicly available goggles today. And whilst I don't have a set side by side to compare, I'm very confident that what I've got is pretty much final hardware. There's always the possibility of maybe a make change on a fan or something like that, but there's nothing I've seen so far that leads me to think mine are any different to anyone else's. Now, what we're going to do next is just take a look at this thermally to give you an idea of what the temps are actually like. Now, we already know this top avatar board will get very hot. We've seen that on the previous systems, but what will be interesting to see is what else is getting hot, how the optical modules look. So what I'm going to do is power them on and leave these settle for about 10 minutes, and then we'll get the thermal camera out. Now, I've spent a lot of time looking at these goggles under the thermal camera, looking at them fully assembled, but also then looking at them in their torn down state to have a better understanding of how they actually behave. Now, there is some very interesting observations. The first thing I want to talk about is the top RF board. Now, this board handles the avatar system as well as the digital transmission, but none of the analog or HDMI are routed through this. Now, this board obviously has the main SoC on the side on the left there that you can see gets hot, but you also have these two transceivers before the power amplifier, which is that little dark blue square in the middle. What's interesting is these transceivers are producing heat in every mode. Whilst they definitely get hotter when in avatar mode, as I showed initially, here they are now in analog on HDMI, and they're still pumping out 50-60 degrees, which tells us that this top board is still fully active. We now know CaddX have stopped the transmitting on these goggles in analog as well as HDMI, but the transceivers are still active, and I don't really understand why that is the case, because they are simply not needed when in those other modes, whereas the main SoC would still have to be powered up because the main OS for the goggles does run on that. Now, as you can see here, the heat from that board is very visible in the top right-hand side of this thermal image. If we take a look at it from above, what's actually very interesting is that you can see the two different areas of where the airflow path is. So the area at the back towards the face mask, you can actually see a cold long strip. That is the airflow from that fan on the side being driven over the top and out of that back vent, whereas the front section that is separated off is a lot hotter. That is the part that isn't getting that same airflow because it is separated off by that partition that runs down the middle of the top panel. If we take a look at the bottom vent, you can see that center area is definitely warmer, as we would expect. That's where that internal fan is going to be blowing that air into, but it isn't looking like that front area on the front of the goggle. Obviously, it isn't going to be as hot as the areas that aren't cooled, but you can see where that temperature is actually moving around the front of the goggle. And if we look over to the right, which is actually that side that gets very hot, you can see there the boards are showing hotter around the HDMI ports as well. It is worth remembering this thermal camera is designed to show temperature differences. Whilst one area is very red and one area might be blue, that doesn't necessarily mean it is a dramatic difference in temperature. That could be 10-15 degrees. In fact, on the top, we were seeing about 20 degrees on the back vent and 40 degrees on the front of it. And here you can see some temperature differences, again, just demonstrating what is being seen. Now, just moving to the face mask area, again, as I showed in my initial review, that right-hand side is showing a lot more heat than the rest of it. You have that bleed from that module bay at the top, but you can also see through that vent, which looks directly in towards the power and the HDMI boards, some heat behind it as well. Now, my initial thoughts when I had these goggles was that these vents actually expelled air. However, now I have understood the airflow a little bit better. They actually don't. They draw air in through the back end of the goggle for that front fan and expel it out the front. I can demonstrate this just by holding this little piece of metal in front of the vent. If there was air coming out of this, it would begin to warm. However, it remains completely cool when we leave it by this one. But if I move it to the front vent and leave it there for a couple of seconds, you'll see it will start to increase in temperature, and you can see that on the thermal camera. Alongside this board producing heat, you then have the main I/O board on the front. Now, this board mostly consists of voltage regulation as well as the HDMI switch and the analog to digital converter for the AV input. Now, this board does get warm in use with Avatar. However, it does start to get quite hot, especially when using it in analog or in HDMI. There is about a 5 to 10 degree temperature difference between using the goggles in Avatar mode and using the goggles in the other input modes for this front board. What's also very interesting is where the heat is. It is predominantly on the side of this board that is directly in front of that right-hand display as looking at it from the back, so the right-hand side, or if you're looking at it from the front, on the left. You can see here it is showing a dramatic difference between one side of the board to the other, and this heat is directly in front of that display. And whilst you do have that fan at the front drawing air out of the goggle, it is clear that right-hand display not only has a big heat source in front of it with that front I/O board, but also a heat source above it from the main RF board as well. I also wanted to have a look at how the optical modules look. Now this is obviously in free air, although it is worth noting that there's not really any cooling here. The front fan is there, but there's a completely open top casing and the side fan has been removed. What you can see is both modules don't look particularly hot, getting roughly 30 odd degrees, but the left or the right module, depending on which side you're looking at, right hand from the back, is definitely seeing increased temperature over the other. And again, that's as a result of having that board at the front so close, producing a lot more heat. Now, just looking at this in real world, you can see here is that main PCB with the two transceivers over there. If we just lift this board out of the way, it is fully enclosed underneath. But if we then flip this back, what you then have is that right-hand display module located here. And whilst there isn't direct airflow going down, there is this little channel here. What you do, though, have is heat transfer, which is going to come through the plastic, and it is going to make it to this area here. Then, on top of that, you have that PCB at the front, like I showed on the thermal, over this area here, which does get very hot, and there is very little distance between this board and this optical module, so it's really getting hammered from two sides. It's getting heat coming down from the top, as well as heat from that PCB at the front. Now, just to give you an idea of what is exactly getting hot on that front board, this is the same layout as you see it in the front of the goggles. So this is the main display driver IC in the middle. That is the LT8668SX. That is taking the input from the Avatar HD module, from the HDMI, from the analog, and that is driving both the displays. You can then see on either side the display connectors. We then, on this side, have some voltage regulation, and then there is more voltage regulation down here on the left. This is the area that is getting hot directly in front of that display. However, I don't actually believe it is this voltage regulator as such that is creating all of that heat. If we flip over to the other side of the board, that side we were seeing there is now this side here, and you can see that there are two additional chipsets. We have the HDMI input switch at the bottom, as well as the analog to digital converter IC above it. This switch is what's taking the input from that analog converter, as well as the HDMI input from this connector at the side, and that is then passing it on to that main display driver IC over here. What you've got, though, is these two ICs that are clearly generating heat alongside that voltage regulator on the other side of the board, and that is what is going to be increasing the temperature in front of that right hand display. Now, what is rather interesting is this is all quite active even when the goggles are in avatar mode, and it's very similar to what I mentioned earlier, that in HDMI and analog mode you have the transceivers active on the RF board, whereas in avatar mode you still have these components down here active, and this one specifically appears to be generating a lot of heat, and that is the HDMI switch. I don't know if CaddX could improve this by shutting that down when using the goggles in avatar mode, but obviously that's not going to help when using the goggles in HDMI, and as a result of this you have a number of components here creating heat. Yes, that front IC definitely creates heat as well, but that is directly above the fan that sits below, whereas these are to the side, and again, whilst airflow is definitely going to be drawn over them, there isn't a lot of space there between these components and the back of that display. Now, as I've already said, I've not actually experienced this issue in the real world at all. I have done a crazy amount of testing on my goggles on the bench before release. They've literally been cooked here for over 2 hours whilst I was doing latency testing, link testing on the spectrum analyzer, and I've never been able to replicate this issue. I have also tested it in all of the modes as well. However, to try and force this issue, what we're going to do is try and put these into a situation with the ambient temperatures even higher and see if I can cause it to happen. Now, to try and replicate this issue, I put my goggles into my 3D printer. We set the bed temp to 60 degrees first of all and allowed the cabinet temperature to get up to about 25°C. I powered them on with the default settings and I put them in full transmit in Avatar HD mode and left them. Now, they were in this printer in total for about 2 hours. You can see here that the display temps are shown on the screen. You can see LED 1, which is the right hand display, was at 41 degrees, and then the left hand one was lagging a little bit behind. Leaving it longer, you could see I managed to get the temps up to 58 degrees, then 67 degrees after leaving it for about an hour. In all of this time, in this initial testing, I was not able to get the goggles to go faulty. They were working as expected, with the module maintaining about 70 degrees at the top. To push things even further, I increased the bed temperature up to 70 degrees, which increased the cavity temp up to about 31, 32, and I increased the display brightness from the default setting of 3 to maximum to really see just what would happen in the worst case scenario. Now, it sat here like this for about 40 minutes. This was straight after the original testing with no cooling downtime. Then I had found the right-hand display had actually powered down after about 44 minutes. And the left-hand display is fine. However, the right-hand display has gone off. I'm getting nothing on it at all. If we now have a look at the recording, you can see the output for the goggles is still fine. However, LED 1 is 44 degrees, LED 2 is 60. Now, I've rebooted the goggles and both displays are now working. However, what's interesting is that the left-hand display looks fine, but the right-hand display now has a green tinge to it. It's quite hard to show you on my phone camera, but it is definitely the case. After the goggles came back on, you can clearly see that the temps very quickly got back above 70 degrees. And if you're someone who is suffering from this issue, you should be able to see what the display temp was, even if you weren't in the avatar mode. Simply switch back, power on, and it will give you an indication if you are getting up to these kind of levels. I have seen people mention having problems at much lower temperatures than this, and we'll talk about that a bit more later on. Now, having torn them down, done all the thermal testing and baked them in my printer, I do have some thoughts. I'm not going to say the thermal design of these goggles is terrible, bad, or completely compromised. However, it is also far from optimal. As you have seen in the thermal shots, the right-hand side of the goggles definitely get dramatically hotter than the left. We have two heat sources in play here. You have the heat source, which is the RF module on the top, and whilst that is venting some of its heat out of the top, the front section of it absolutely isn't, and that is definitely soaking into the goggles above that right-hand optical area. You then have that front I/O board, which is also driving in more heat. And then you have the other power boards on the side of the goggles as well. And there is no question that the right-hand side of the goggle runs hotter than the left-hand side. And that is the side that is going to struggle to maintain its temperatures, especially once you start to push the ambience up. As I showed though, in my testing, I was only able to actually get problems by forcing the goggles into a situation that I haven't used them in before. We got the ambient temperatures up to 32, 33 degrees, and only then after sort of 2 hours in total, or 40 minutes of those temperatures, was I able to actually force the issue to kick in. And I haven't seen it happen in any other situation other than that. That isn't to say that the goggles aren't somewhat already compromised as a result of having that increased temps on the right. There are some really strange little things here with regards to this as well. For instance, the fact that those RF transceivers are still producing heat whilst the goggles are in analog mode or in HDMI, and the fact that there are not thermal pads on the back of those displays, but there isn't anything to say if they are going to be what makes the difference between the goggles operating normally or not for people who are seeing issues. Whilst the thermal pads themselves may not make a dramatic difference, what would help is if CaddX was able to shut down those transceivers in those other modes, although that isn't going to help obviously when using them with the Avatar HD system. It is worth noting though that that front board does get about 5 degrees hotter when using it with HDMI or analog, and the fact that those transceivers are still pumping in heat means that if you were able to get more heat away from the top, there is the potential to be able to bring down the overall ambient temperatures, and it could push them further away from the maximum operating numbers. As I showed already, these OLEDs will work up to 70 degrees C, and in my tests I wasn't actually able to get them to fail until I hit closer to 80, but that isn't to say some will not start to play up around the 70 mark, but there's no reason that these displays would play up below 70 degrees C, but it's going to depend on what you're seeing on your goggles, if this is actually an overheating issue or not, and we're going to talk about that side of things a little bit more in a minute. Now, as there's been this belief this issue is caused by the goggles overheating, there's been a number of solutions offered. One of these is actually from CaddX. They've offered this user this heatsink. This replaces that metal panel on the top of the top RF module, and it has additional surface area which should help keep it cooler. Alongside this, there's also been a number of mods from users, including this new top panel, which you can 3D print and mount a fan into. Now, both of these solutions are basically going to do the same thing, which is try and remove as much of the heat as it can from that top area of the goggles, and that should help prevent that heat soak making it down towards the displays. What isn't clear though is if that is a real solution for the problem people are seeing, because we don't actually know what the cause of that problem is yet. Whilst there's a belief it's overheating, I still haven't seen any real evidence to suggest that other people's goggles are actually getting up towards this 70-80 degrees temperature on the right hand display in real world use. But I do sort of get what CaddX are trying to do, and it would be interesting to try it and see what the difference is with and without that heatsink installed, but obviously it's going to need a different top panel. With regards to the user-based mod, that is something I may do some work with in the future and do some testing on. Again, it's going to try and do the same thing. However, I actually don't see that making a big difference because the fan that's already there on the side is actually powerful enough to drive plenty of air through. As you've seen on the thermals, that back section was nice and cold. An additional fan there isn't really going to do much. What you need is more surface area on the heatsink, as CaddX are adding on that additional heatsink option. As for the front cooling system on these goggles, and what you have is a system that is basically trying to draw air in via the goggles mask area at the back through these vents, as well as pull it down from the top here. As I've said, you've got this front area here, which is slightly separate, and this fan then is trying to expel that out the bottom. The problem is this vent is very poor. It's going to be pushing as hard as it can up against this, but this is a massive restriction compared to, say, what the fan would usually be pushing up against, and as a result of that, the actual airflow is going to be heavily limited. And whilst that is largely doing what it's expected to do, where my concerns are is around how hot that board gets on the front of this with that HDMI converter in the analog IC. It does get hotter in use with analog and HDMI than it does in normal avatar use, but there's only about 5-6 degrees in that. But what is clear is, looking at the thermal images, there is a much bigger thermal mass on this side of the goggles compared to on this side, and that is directly in front of that display module. There is virtually no space there, as I've shown in the video, for airflow to make it through, and the heat sinks on these displays are well countersunk and covered over by that cable that goes to that front unit as well. And basically it's going to have very limited passive cooling with no real airflow being passed over it. What is not fully understood though is how hot the displays actually get in real world use. But as we saw in the teardown images, the way CaddX have actually set it up isn't particularly great. You have that heatsink, which is basically just sitting on top of the connector. There's no thermal pads there. There's nothing to actually move that heat away from the back of the display at all, and only a very small part of that heatsink actually touches that back metal panel of the display. The rest of it simply sits on top of the connector. Whilst there will absolutely be thermal conductivity between that, without any thermal pads it's going to be very, very limited. However, what there really isn't is a lot of room for error here on that side, and what you're getting is that front board heat the air around that area, and whilst you're trying to draw that away with that front fan, you're relying on there being enough airflow around that heatsink on the display for it to passively cool itself, and I think it is in a situation on that side specifically that it is struggling to do it. Overall, I don't actually think the thermal design of these goggles is terrible, but there are improvements CaddX could make without a complete redesign. For starters, shutting down those RF transceivers when the goggles are in HDMI or analog. They don't need to be running. I don't know if they can do that in software, but that would certainly help reduce the heat creep from that top board. Secondly, it would be good to see some thermal pads on the displays rather than it just being this heatsink mounted to the back. Some thermal pads there would definitely help draw the heat away, maybe one below the connector and one on top of it, just helping to move that heat away from the back. However, as you have seen today, the space there is very limited. There isn't really a lot more they can do other than that to allow it to be able to get some more passive cooling. What you could do do though is install another small fan in these goggles. That could be done. However, it is worth noting that my goggles only failed when I put them in my 3D printer with an ambient temperature of 33 degrees for an hour and a half with the display brightness set to maximum. I have not seen an issue on my goggles in real world use in any mode, and it was only by doing that was I able to get the display up to about 80 degrees, and that was the point the right hand one failed. It is worth also remembering that OLEDs do have an upper operating temperature range of about 70 degrees, so mine failed exactly where I would have expected them to. What's actually interesting though, when you start looking into the issue other people are facing, is things are not the same as what I'm seeing, and people are actually getting their displays failing at lower temperatures. What's also interesting is when you start to look at people's reports of issues, there are things that stand out that tell us it may not be quite as simple as the goggles not getting enough cooling. For instance, as I showed, I could only get mine to misbehave when I pushed them beyond the OLED's operating temperature, which was 70 to 80 degrees. There are people though giving us solid reports of their displays paying up with temperatures as low as 50 to 60 degrees. This is absolutely not normal. Those displays should be able to handle temperatures well above that, and as I said, up towards 80, no problem at all. What I would say is this: if you are someone who is having a problem with that OLED, turn on that 10% mode and have a look at how hot your display is. If it is not getting towards 80 degrees, you have something else going on, and it probably isn't cooling related. I have a belief that this problem may not actually be the OLED itself. It could be the driver IC on the OLED display, or even a component on the connection lines between the display driver and the display itself that is going out of spec with heat. It's worth remembering in those thermal images that I showed, that side of the board does get very, very hot. There are a number of passive components on that side of the board on the MIPI lines to the display, and it could be as simple as one of them going out of spec and causing the issue. There is a very interesting telltale sign on this problem that when it happens, it will not reset itself to normal until you reboot the goggles, and that tells us something else is going on. If it was the display itself overheating, you would get this gradual change in color, and that then should shift back as the display cools down. But it has been confirmed by a number of people, including in my own tests, that the display will only come back to normal once it's been powered down and rebooted, even if the OLED has been cooled. Here and now, we still don't know what the actual cause is, but my opinion remains that if you are having this issue, the first thing you should do is check your goggle temps, as I showed how to do in this video. If the display temps are not remotely near that 75-80 degrees, something else is going on. Send the goggles back. The chances are either the display is faulty or there is a faulty component on the front board. I don't believe there is any amount of modification that you can do to solve it if it is happening at temperatures below 75-80 degrees, and there is an inherent fault on that specific goggle, because not everyone is having this. And again, as I've shown today, my goggles are only doing it when I basically cook them in an oven. If you are checking this and your displays are up to those high temperatures, then you want to make sure that both fans are running on the goggles. You should be easily able to hear the one on the side here as well as the one here on the bottom. And if you're still getting issues and your displays are that hot, even if the fans are running, then again, I still think there is something else going on, and send the goggles back. Here and now, there is no evidence that any mod that I've seen is going to help this, but most cases that I've seen so far aren't even getting near the temperatures that I had to get to cause the problem. And as a result of that, as I've already said, this really does feel like there's a component issue specifically for some, rather than it being a general overall overheating problem. Now, I am really interested in hearing your thoughts on this problem. If you have it, please let me know what temperatures your displays are getting to in the comment section. If you're getting it in HDMI or analog, Go into Avatar, set it to 10% zoom, make it happen, and then quickly switch back and have a look at what temp that display is at. Whilst you won't be seeing what it peaked at, it'll give you an indication if you're getting anywhere near that 70 or 80 degrees. In a few seconds, it's certainly not going to cool from 70 degrees down to 50. Now, I just want to say, if you have found this video useful and interesting, please do consider checking out the links to my Patreon, as well as buy me a coffee in the description. It is only through the support of my patrons I'm able to keep making content on this channel, and if you'd like to support us to allow us to keep making content in the future, please do consider checking it out. I want to say a massive thank you to all of my Patreons on this channel, everyone who supports us via channel membership as well, and everyone who has sent donations. We would not be able to keep doing this without your support. Anyway, that's it from me on this one. Let me know what you think in the comment section. Don't forget to give it a like as well. Stay safe. I'll speak to you soon.